event with eager anticipation for quite some time. Those of you who saw the coverage of the conference day before yesterday in the public press will have read that Luther sparked a theological and societal revolution from the boondocks of Wittenberg, a Catholic monastic turned renegade, at a point in history not dissimilar to our own. As the title of this conference makes clear, Luther's long arm stretches not only forward in time, but also outward throughout the world, and his global impact should become, I think, increasingly clear over the next couple days. We have debts to acknowledge. We are profoundly grateful to many institutions as well as individuals for the work they have done and the funding they have provided for this conference. The Office of the President at Northwestern, the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, the Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Departments of Religion, German, Philosophy, and Art History, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, the University Lutheran Church at Northwestern, Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Evanston, Trinity Lutheran Church in Evanston, Thrive Financial for Lutherans, Fortress Press, the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Chicago, the German Academic Exchange Service. We are grateful to all of these for the support they have provided for this major event. In addition, I should say that we are deeply grateful to the organizers of the conference, most especially Christine Helmer, whose energy, resourcefulness, and dedication to this cause have been truly an inspiration to us. I am assured that the speakers will be here momentarily, that they are mere blocks away from us, or were a few minutes ago. Let me give you background for both of this evening's keynote speakers. Peter C. Hodgson is Charles Finney Professor of Theology Emeritus at Vanderbilt University, where he taught from 1965 to 2003. He is the author, editor, and translator of over 20 books, ranging from general works on theology, works on the proofs for the existence of God, as set forth by Hegel, Hegel and Christian theology, and several other topics. We look forward very much to hearing his address this evening. The last time I was there, I think it was in Nashville. Risto Saarinen is professor of ecumenical theology at the University of Helsinki. He served as research professor at the Institute for Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg from 1994 to 1999. He is author of numerous books, articles, encyclopedia entries in German and English. His most recent book, God and the Gift, An Ecumenical Theology of Giving, came out in 2005. And with that, we are prepared for the presentations, which will be forthcoming momentarily. Professor Hodgson. Very well, Professor Saarinen.
Good evening. It's very nice to be here. Americans are tonight following the debate between Obama and Clinton, but we are starting a new debate, a debate on Martin Luther. not in University of Texas, but at the Northwestern University. And the topic which Professor Christina Helmer gave me, kind of very broad topic, is Luther, the urban legend. Important historical figures are often surrounded by a hagiography, in which their deeds, personality, and teachings become equipped with an aura of omnipotence. They are compared with other great men and women of the past, with whom they show more or less obvious likeness. Martin Luther is no exception in this regard. He emerges as a new Apostle Paul or as a new Augustine who shows the Church the right path leading to the future. Luther appears as a forerunner of modernity who has grasped the importance of individual freedom as well as the fundamental equality of all human persons. Modern Lutheran practices like comprehensive education, healthcare, and social aid can be interpreted and are, at least in Europe, often interpreted as later extensions of Luther's and the Reformation's original ideas. Historical and theological scholars need to find their way through this hagiography or urban legend. The category of urban legend is often understood to denote a story which is assumed to be true, while in reality it is not. It is more accurate, however, to define an urban legend as a story which is transmitted as a true story, whereas the participants do not know its actual truth value. Irrespectively of their truth value, urban legends can serve as important factors of history and group identity. Given that a large group steadfastly believes a certain story to be true, it plays an important role in the behavior of this group. Urban legends and stories are fascinating but complicated building blocks of historical and contemporary identity. The heroes are often not innocent regarding the legends concerning them. They are themselves very concerned with how the next generations will remember them and consciously aim at shaping this memory already in their lifetime. In the following, I will discuss some urban stories circulating around the person and thought of Martin Luther. Because so many different aspects of Luther's person and thought are wrapped in legend, it is impossible to attempt a comprehensive view. I can only undertake a series of exploratory drillings into different soils so that we can see the samples in their rich variety. I will make my own evaluations and judgments, not in order to close the discussion, but rather to continue the rich history of interpretation. Martin Luther denies an easy access. He was a complex and many-sided personality, and his enormous literary output contains elements which can be used for different purposes. I will investigate some stories which relate Luther's name to more recent historical and contemporary currents, and especially such stories and views in which Luther is compared favorably or unfavorably to later currents and ideals of Western history. Now to my first example or comparison. One genre of urban stories connects the great man with his predecessors, like Luther is connected with Paul or Augustine. Another genre with which we are more interested tonight connects the hero with his followers and other later figures. When we discuss Luther's global impact, this second genre is particularly important. Later currents of thought have either identified themselves with Luther or taken a conscious distance from his views. For better or worse, Luther is regarded as a typically German figure. Although the German state did not exist in the 16th century, Luther's writings gave the German language much of its later form and established many important aspects of German cultural identity. If we aim at discussing the global Luther, we have to develop an opinion concerning the relationship between the German and the non-national or cross-cultural aspects of his thought. This is not an easy task, and my paper only begins this discussion through relating Luther with some other cultural mentalities and comparing Luther with other mentalities. I will start with the easiest point of comparison, namely the mentality of the English-speaking culture. Which early modern figure would an average English-speaking college or university student of today be most familiar with? If we look not so much political figures, but if we look at literary texts, William Shakespeare is the obvious answer. Shakespeare has the great advantage of being the most creative force in the development of English language and literary culture. In that sense, he can be compared with Luther's cultural significance. In short, Shakespeare has been formative to the English mindset in ways that resemble Luther's importance for the German-speaking people. Let us imagine how a truly sympathetic reader of Shakespeare would evaluate the relationship between the English poet and the German reformer. The following picture might emerge. I have footnotes which I will not read here, but I have collected this picture from several recent studies on Shakespeare as well as from my own reading. Shakespeare can see the life and fates of people in their manifold variety. Life is both comedy and tragedy. It is good to be sympathetic to suffering people, but one-sided seriousness is not the adequate relationship to life in its fullness. Religious people, like Luther, have a tendency to disregard the great variety of life, because religious people believe to have found an absolute answer to all questions, but in reality they only ask a very limited set of questions. Religious people tend to be hypocritical and they lack a sense of humor. Shakespeare shows the positive value of good emotions. He can appreciate divine powers but does not claim to have a normative vision or control over religious issues. Therefore, he is a much better guide for modern people than the narrow-minded professor from Wittenberg. So this is more a kind of Shakespearean perspective. This story claims something about Shakespeare and Luther, maybe also something about English and German mentality. Its claims are sweeping claims, and thus it is difficult to discuss them properly. What can be done is some historical groundwork regarding the impact of Luther on Shakespeare. So Luther was some 50 years, maybe a little bit more older than Shakespeare, and it can be assumed that Shakespeare knew at least something on Luther and the German Reformation. Shakespeare's comments on Luther and Lutheranism have often been seen to take place in Hamlet. As observed from England, Denmark is the nearest Lutheran country. The Prince of Denmark is also mentioned in the play to have studied in Wittenberg. More importantly, the melancholy character of Hamlet has been seen in connection with Luther. Luther's heroic melancholy was underlined in the 16th century literature. Both Luther and Hamlet are often compared to Hercules, the classic hero Hercules, who is the classical symbol of heroic melancholy. The best-known allusion to Luther's Reformation in Hamlet is the famous wordplay relating to the emperor at the 1521 Diet of Worms. Hamlet responds to the question about where he put the body or corpse of Polonius as follows, quote, "Not where he eats, but where he is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are even at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Hamlet 4:3. Hamlet's depression and temptations, as well as his criticism of philosophy, exemplified in the famous line, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophy," match well with this picture of Luther. Luther and Hamlet are united in their view of the hiddenness of God, Deus absconditus, who is concealed under the opposite and cannot be reached by means of philosophy. But finally, Shakespeare is in Hamlet only showing that the story told above is true. There is something rotten in the continental European spirit which remains depressed and fixated on the dark side. The urban story is not merely a product of later times, but it has also some foundation in the original texts. The most Lutheran play of Shakespeare is not, however, Hamlet, but a little less known play, namely Measure for Measure. This claim has its textual justification in the circumstance that Shakespeare's plot is evidently taken from Luther, namely of Luther's writing of Worldly Authority, 1523. Luther tells the story as follows. So this is a story told by Luther and then employed by Shakespeare in the play Measure for Measure. A certain nobleman took an enemy prisoner. The prisoner's wife came to ransom her husband. The nobleman promised to give back the husband on the condition that she would lie with him. The woman was virtuous, yet wished to set her husband free. So she goes and asks her husband whether she should do this thing in order to set him free. The husband wished to be set free and to save his life, so he gives his wife permission. After the nobleman had lain with the wife, he had the husband beheaded the next day and gave him to her as a corpse. She laid the whole case before Duke Charles. He summoned the nobleman and commanded him to marry the woman. When the wedding day was over, he had the nobleman beheaded. He gave the woman possession of his property and restored her to honor. This is the story which appears in the last page of Luther's of Worldly Authority. For Luther, the story exemplifies the flexibility of worldly authority, which should not, quote from Luther, make reason a captive of letters, but is called to keep written laws subject to reason. So the cleverness of the Duke Charles is a kind of paradigm of natural reason which is somehow higher than written laws. Maybe not so transparent for contemporary mindset, but for Luther it was a kind of proof text for this kind of natural reason. In Shakespeare's version, the relationship between law and reason is more complex. The heroine of Measure for Measure is Isabella, a young nun who first pleads for the liberty of her brother, arguing that mercy is greater than punishment. The nobleman in charge of the prisoner wants to lie with the nun. He turns Isabella's own merciful argument against her. Because she so sincerely believes in grace and mercy, she should without problems excuse herself so that she and her brother need not feel guilty in paying this price for his freedom. Isabella is, however, more firm than the wife in Luther's story and refuses to sleep with the nobleman. Now the nobleman accuses her of failing to act according to her own principles. The nun first claims that grace and mercy are greater than the law, but she cannot apply this claim to her own moral situation. The dialogues, Shakespeare's dialogues between Isabella and the nobleman, are in fact deep theological treatises which investigate in detail the relationship between law and gospel, justice and mercy. Shakespeare is well aware of the Lutheran claims following from the distinction between law and gospel. He is sympathetic to this distinction but also critical of it. Through the confusion of Isabella, Shakespeare aims at showing that the people who proclaim the superiority of mercy and grace do not understand its proper relationship to justice and to law. A careful reader of Measure for Measure realizes that the relationship between Luther and Shakespeare is more complex than any superficial story of the differences between German or English mentalities assumes. Shakespeare may be critical of Protestantism. He is sometimes seen as a hidden Catholic, but he understands very well the fine distinctions between law and mercy, which is very interesting because in Anglican theology you don't have so much discussion on law and gospel, but in this play of Shakespeare you have a very elaborate discussion on law and gospel. The heroine of Measure for Measure is a very Lutheran character. Her only fault is that her Lutheran theology is not as consistent as she first believes. The male hero of this play is the Duke, who only appears in the end of the play to solve the situation and to punish the nobleman. In doing this, the Duke does not use arguments. Although Isabella's reasoning has been seriously defective, it is nevertheless the best reasoning performed in the play, and in that sense I would somehow be sympathetic to the idea that Shakespeare did not only know Lutheran distinction of law and gospel, but he considered it is a very, very good way of putting or making explicit the difficult problems of law and mercy. The dialectic between law and gospel, justice and mercy, finally transcends the boundaries of nationality and mentality. Shakespeare is extremely interested in this dialectic and also competent to discuss it in detail. The underlying issue is the perennial question: how can we find a merciful God? Or, in a more human way, how can we understand which actions in reality can count as merciful? Shakespeare can show that the finding of merciful actions may be even more difficult than Lutherans generally believe. But in Measure for Measure, he asks the same questions regarding mercy or grace. The continuous asking of these extremely difficult questions may be one of the most important global impacts of Martin Luther, and this concludes my first example, namely Luther and Shakespeare, coming to the conclusion that the questions of law and mercy are something which transcend the mentality borders. Now I come to my second example on Luther's impact, and that relates Luther to another major figure, namely the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Another great thinker who has reflected on the deep waters of mercy is Søren Kierkegaard. Like Shakespeare, he is a prominent example of the interrelated problems of nationality, mentality, and Lutheranism. In Northern Europe, where I myself come from, it has been for a long time customary to see Kierkegaard as a true representative of Lutheranism. Lutheran pietists in particular have welcomed Kierkegaard as their patron saint, seeing in him the struggle of individual conscience and the genuine way of being a Christian in the modern era. When we discuss Martin Luther's relationship to the legends of modernity and individualism, Kierkegaard's thought is a place to start. The assumed likeness between Luther and Kierkegaard is due to the so-called Luther Renaissance, a German movement of the 1920s, which admired Kierkegaard's individualism and saw Luther through the eyes of modern philosophical schools. In the writings of Karl Holl, leading German proponent of Luther Renaissance, and some later scholars, in Finland for instance Lennart Pinomaa, in America the young Jaroslav Pelikan, who in 1950 published his book From Luther to Kierkegaard. The professor from Wittenberg emerges as a 16th century Kierkegaard who struggles with his own conscience and performs a leap of faith against the rest of the world. According to this type of Luther research, the German reformer is not primarily a forerunner of modernity, but an almost postmodern figure who does not believe in grand narratives but constructs his own existence through the inner struggle with anxiety, desperation, and temptations. Luther scholars have employed Kierkegaard as a guarantor for a religious worldview which draws back from nationalism towards subjective freedom and sees religion as an individual and private conviction. This understanding has had obvious appeal for both European and American Lutherans. Even Karl Holl, who is known for his very conscientious and detailed research, can make a sweeping claim in this regard. I quote Holl, "Luther comes to the issues which the great way opener Paul had foreseen, and for which first Søren Kierkegaard in the 19th century, as well as Nietzsche, have shown an understanding." End of quote. Karl Holl here refers to Luther's struggle with genuine penitence, the so-called act of contrition. One problem with Karl Holl and his followers is that they are for the most part interpreting and discussing the earlier monastic texts of Luther. In these texts, the inner struggle sometimes receives really extreme dimensions. Luther aims at renouncing everything, attempting, as he once formulates the issue, to nail himself so high on the cross that his own feet would no longer touch the ground. In this uncompromising attitude, he does display some Kierkegaardian and pietist features. At some point, Luther realizes, however, that this path does not lead to real renunciation, but rather to self-righteousness. Nailing himself always higher on the cross, he aims at ascending rather than descending. Contemporary Luther scholars point out that the so-called Demutstheology, a theology of self-humiliation, remains a transitory phase in Luther's development. Later, at least since 1518, 1519, Luther realizes that the world is God's good gift, which needs to be affirmed and not merely renounced. More importantly, Luther realizes that the very process of renunciation cannot be absolutized. From a certain point onwards, the process of renunciation becomes self-righteous. A person in this process does not trust in God, but aims at justifying himself or herself through ascetic means. Unlike the Kierkegaardians of the 20th century, the Danish philosopher himself is much more reserved in his understanding of Martin Luther. The younger Kierkegaard appreciated Luther's honest struggle with conscience and temptations, but over the years he increasingly considers Luther's relationship to both world and society to be problematic. For Kierkegaard, the ascetic lifestyle inevitably belongs to true Christianity. When Luther left behind the exaggerated ascesis and began to affirm worldly structures, he, according to Kierkegaard, compromised his own reformatory ideals. Luther's marriage in particular was for Kierkegaard a false move which showed complicity with the world. Luther did not finally have the proper rigor to follow the existential dialectics, as can be shown his marrying Katharina von Bora and having children with her. In this manner, Kierkegaard actually understood his own fundamental difference to Luther much better, I would say, than the Luther scholars who remain enchanted by the Danish radical. Now I come to some smaller examples and considerations regarding Luther and modernity. The connections between Luther and modernity concern a much broader range of topics than the issue of individualism or subjectivism alone can make visible. In the 19th and early 20th century, Luther was often joined with Immanuel Kant, who was seen as the philosopher of Protestantism par excellence. Still today, Luther's conception of freedom, in particular his view of the freedom of conscience, is seen as a forerunner of modernity. Prominent scholars like Gerhard Ebeling or Hans Reiner claim that Luther is the first thinker to have formulated the phrase liberty of conscience. This claim is false. The phrase already appears in late antiquity in the Consolation of Philosophy of Boethius as well as in Cassiodorus. But again, the false claim contains a grain of truth. Freedom of conscience was only rarely mentioned in medieval Latin, but after Luther and Calvin it became a prominent topic, which guided the discussion on individual freedom and basic human rights. Luther did not invent the phrase, but he made it prominent. At the same time, it should be noticed that the prominence of the phrase did not imply any really consistent understanding of the phenomenon of respect or toleration. The radical reformers did not enjoy the same freedom of conscience which was claimed for Lutherans or Calvinists. The end result is thus complex. Luther did not invent the freedom of conscience. The term is older, the phenomenon younger than the Reformation. And yet, Luther contributed to the emergence of this phenomenon as well as to the understanding of the term in its current meaning. Some other issues which relate Luther to modernity and individual rights yield similar results. The rights and practices pertaining to sexual ethics are a good example, and I now warn you already that my following reflections are contrary to the received opinion of the Luther research, so that if you are annoyed, so maybe you have the right reason to be annoyed because this is not the opinio communis. Because Luther allowed pastors to marry and because he wrote influential treatises on marriage, many historians and theologians have evaluated his contribution as an affirmation of human sexuality and as liberation from oppressive practices. At the same time, however, a careful reader of Luther's treatises may obtain a different picture. Luther often denies the human possibility to control one's own sexuality. It is better to marry than to burn. Celibacy only leads to more grave sins because positive control cannot be achieved. In Luther's view, living with a woman without having sex with her is more difficult than waking the dead, as he says. Habitare enim cum muliere et eam non cognoscere plus est quam mortuos excitare. But if Luther radicalizes Augustine's negative view of sexuality as an uncontrollable power, it would be difficult to say that his sexual ethics affirms eros as a positive power. It is rather the case that his view is so negative that he simply needs to allow marriage to everyone as the lesser evil. As a result, marriage is not something controlled by the free will of the spouses, but it is an institution controlled by the broader society. Given this, the secularization of marriage in the Lutheran Reformation need not be read in terms of healthy affirmation of created powers, but rather as a concession to the problematic power of sex. This understanding of sexuality is concomitant with the control power which Luther ascribes to worldly and ecclesial authorities. Even Christians are so weak that they need to be governed by the external ordinances, structures of the surrounding society. The consent of the spouses is not enough to constitute marriage, but parental consent and a public notice of the intended marriage are also needed. Christianity had for 1500 years adhered to the Roman practice of regarding marriage as a contract between the two partners. The Lutheran Reformation made it additionally dependent on the public authorities. This innovation was probably the only matter which the Roman Catholic Council of Trent took over from the Reformation. The Roman Council of Trent also made sacrament of marriage dependent on this public notice and worldly authorities. Lutherans do not normally interpret Luther's view of sexuality and marriage in this manner, but it is entirely possible and historically adequate to do so. Luther's relationship to the modern views of marriage and sexuality therefore remains ambivalent. It is likely that the institution of marriage became socially upgraded as a result of the Reformation, but human sexuality continued to be understood in Augustinian terms. Luther's global impact in this respect remains to be studied and better understood. And now, after this somewhat critical part, comes a more positive side. It is not Luther's affirmation of human sexuality which makes the difference, but rather his so-called affirmation of ordinary life. The term ordinary life comprises one's family life as well as one's profession. Among contemporary thinkers, Charles Taylor in particular has highlighted the importance of this phenomenon as a connection point between the Reformation and modernity. Taylor claims that the Reformation was characterized by, quote, the affirmation that the fullness of Christian existence was to be found within the activities of this life, in one's calling and in marriage and the family. The entire modern development of the affirmation of ordinary life was, I believe, foreshadowed and initiated in all its facets in the spirituality of the reformers, end of quote. Like Karl Holl, Gerhard Ebeling, and many other scholars, Charles Taylor sees the Reformation as a forerunner of modernity. But he does not consider this role to consist in a Kierkegaardian subjectivity, in the freedom of conscience, or in a new view concerning sexuality. But the concept of modern selfhood, the main topic of Taylor's magnum opus Sources of the Self, receives from the Reformation is no individualistic feature, but a communitarian virtue of partnership and active participation in the worldly calling. To make his point clear, Taylor elaborates on the concept of renunciation. While Socrates and the Stoics claimed that they do not in fact lose anything in renouncing the world, Christians have always experienced that in renouncing the world, they really lose something of God's good creation. Thus, quote Taylor, Christian renunciation is an affirmation of the goodness of what is renounced, end of quote. Renunciation and asceticism are therefore ambivalent phenomena, which may lead into a real loss of good life. In Taylor's view, the Protestant reformers were very conscious of this ambivalence. They preached a sort of asceticism, but it was meant to be an inwardly asceticism in which the ordinary life was not renounced but emphatically affirmed. Taylor's ideas can be applied to Luther's monastic experiences. Luther first renounces his worldly life by entering the monastery, but in his later recollections, he is also driven to renounce this first renunciation. Only after the second renunciation can he affirm the evangelical freedom and the goodness of ordinary life. The second renunciation does not, however, extinguish the very idea of renunciation, but continues it in a new manner, making possible the affirmation of ordinary life. Taylor's description of modernity is very different from those interpretations of Luther which see modernity in Kierkegaardian terms. The Danish philosopher remains on the path of first renunciation, which is hostile to ordinary life. In Kierkegaard, the individuality of the subject emerges at the cost of the surrounding world, which is seen as a banal and dull reality. But in Luther's theology, ordinary life with its manifold callings, roles and tasks receives a clear positive value in spite of the continuing rule of sin and the bondage of the will. If we look at Luther's treatises on marriage, it is the multitude of everyday situations vis-a-vis the community, rather than any teaching on individual sexual ethics, which is innovative and distinctive. In this regard, too, Luther is, I think, closer to Shakespeare than to Kierkegaard. Shakespeare's eye for the tiny details of ordinary life, as well as his sense of relationships within the community, are in this Taylorian sense Protestant phenomena. Now I'm coming towards the summary. The global Luther lessons to be learned. Some basic ideas have emerged from our exploratory drillings into the rich soil of Luther and his historical impact. The communitarian understanding of Luther's theology has been emphasized. Luther's thought provides cultural insights which make a dialogue with poets like William Shakespeare and philosophers like Charles Taylor important. In keeping with this emphasis, the linking of Luther with an individualistic understanding of human rights or with a subjectivistic understanding of philosophy can be criticized. Luther finally learned to appreciate the ordinary life with its communitarian ideals. This was not his weakness, as Kierkegaard claimed, but his strength. The most important global impacts of the Reformation are found in this affirmation of ordinary life, with its ideals of good education, social equality, and readiness to love and help one's neighbor. Having said this, I have no intention of being a cultural Protestant, which, at least in European theology, is a kind of derogatory description. I am not pleading for a superficial accommodation of Luther's theology with various cultural externalities. What I want to say is that a careful historian and a careful theologian can see many significant points of contact between the Reformation and modern Western culture. It is also the case that the urban legends and stories surrounding the Reformation are important for our grasp of modernity. These stories are often as old as the events they aim to illuminate and conceal. The stories and legends belong to history as its constitutive elements. Charles Taylor's view has the additional advantage of offering some transcultural possibilities in understanding the very concept of Reformation. This concept is important when we address the issue whether other confessions or even religions can have so-called reformations. Now I'm moving a little bit towards a thin ice, but I think this is more a kind of opening some debate than making a final stance regarding it. Some recent discussion concerning, for instance, the Islamic Reformation considered that the emergence of mass education and mass communication constitutes a new situation in which the larger group can become a subject of religion in a stronger sense than before. Although this analogy remains vague, it is noteworthy that the European Reformation can also be characterized in terms of mass education and mass communication. An affirmation of ordinary life makes civil society a responsible subject in a new sense, since it promotes education as well as the exchange of goods and information. It is even more difficult to address the issue whether we could have Martin Luthers or reformers in other confessions and religions. Although there is some discussion regarding the possibility of an Islamic Luther, very difficult subject, the evidence I have been able to consult is not very illuminating. It is true that there are reformers in Islam and in other religions, but there are analogies, but also so big differences that you have to remain with the vague analogies. Proceeding from the ideal of affirming the ordinary life, we may obtain other analogies which are no less ambivalent. One possibility which is also very ambivalent but also very important in recent church history is the role of José María Escrivá de Balaguer and Opus Dei in 20th century Spain. Opus Dei has promoted just this affirmation of ordinary life and good education in civil society, thus contributing to the social and educational rise of Spain in European Union. The autonomy of professional life, as well as its understanding in terms of religious calling, are ideals which paradoxically Opus Dei shares with the Reformation. Most contemporary Lutherans, as well as most Opus Dei members, would, however, be very embarrassed and somehow uneasy with this comparison, although there are so structural analogies and this kind of professional calling, worldly calling analogies. Charles Taylor connects the Reformation with the emergence of Puritanism, another liaison with which not all Lutherans are happy with or comfortable with. But maybe, I think modern Lutherans have been maybe too allergic regarding the reformation of life preached by Calvinists and Puritans. If we proceed from the affirmation of ordinary life as a central tenet of the Reformation, we obtain a picture in which Calvinists and Puritans are actually following Luther's cultural insights. This picture can also be helpful if we aim at understanding the contemporary quasi-Puritan Reformation movements, either in conservative Catholicism or in radical Islam. They do not pertain only to doctrines, but also, and maybe even primarily, to the comprehensive renovation of life. But of course, at the same time, the ideals of true mercy and reflected renunciation remain vital. One-sided asceticism and moralism need to be left behind in order that mercy and affirmation of the created world may prevail, and this is the primary message of Luther. And in this manner, the finding of a merciful God is an anti-individualistic, cross-cultural, and I think finally global challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk. I think we will proceed directly now to the second talk by Professor Hodgson on Lutheran freedom, and then afterward have questions for both speakers. So, Professor Hodgson.